The origins of Frankenstein. The story of Frankenstein has become a modern myth. If you think about traditional myths, they arise from oral tradition. Generally, they support the traditional social order, obeying your parents, obeying the gods. Traditional monsters that have come to us from these myths include the vampire, the werewolf, the ogre, the witch, and traditional heroes who've come to us from the myths: Hercules, Odysseus, Prometheus, Beowulf, King Arthur. Modern myths are different. First, they don't arise out of oral tradition. They're written at a particular cultural moment. Frankenstein didn't originate in oral tradition. It was created at a particular moment in time by a particular young woman. It doesn't have to support the traditional social order. In fact, it often traces a changing social order. Modern myths include characters that everybody seems to know about, even if they've never read the books. So Don Quixote, Robinson Crusoe, Ebenezer Scrooge, Sherlock Holmes, Tarzan, lots of superheroes. And each one of these modern myths serves a particular purpose in our culture. So as you're reading Frankenstein and thinking about it, I want you to ask yourself, why has this story become a modern myth? What function does it serve in our culture? The modern myth of Frankenstein had its origins during the summer of 1816 in the mind of a young woman, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, when she was 18 years old. But she was no ordinary young woman. She was the daughter of two of the most important radical intellectuals of the 18th century. Both of her parents had been fired with enthusiasm for the French Revolution and its principles: liberty, equality, and fraternity, the brotherhood of all human beings. And they supported these revolutionary ideals in their writings. Her father was William Godwin, whose 1793 book, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice and Its Influence on General Virtue and Happiness, was a philosophical bestseller. His novel, Caleb Williams, published the same year, helped to make him a famous intellectual figure. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was equally important in radical intellectual circles, the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Men, and, of course, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, an excerpt of which we have read. Godwin and Wollstonecraft both regarded marriage as a form of slavery, in which the woman gave up her legal existence and her right to own property. So when they first got together, initially they didn't get married. But when Mary Wollstonecraft became pregnant with her daughter Mary, they finally did decide to get married in order to give their child social legitimacy. But in childbirth, Wollstonecraft contracted an infection. It was called puerperal fever, and died 10 days after Mary's birth, leaving Godwin to rear Mary and her half-sister Fanny Imlay, Wollstonecraft's daughter by an earlier lover. In 1801, Godwin remarried to give these girls a mother. His new wife was named Mary Jane Clairmont, and she was a well-educated woman with two illegitimate children of her own, a son, Charles, and a daughter, Claire Clairmont, who was just less than a year younger than Mary. Mary herself was reared in a highly intellectual household by a father who believed in women's intellectual equality. So while her formal education was not remarkable, her informal education was almost unique for a woman of her time. In 1814, when she was 16 years old, Mary met the young and still largely unknown 21-year-old poet Percy Shelley, a fellow radical, son of a baronet, and admirer of her father, who found this pretty and intelligent young woman fascinating, and the feeling was mutual. However, Percy was, at 21, already married to Harriet Westbrook, and William Godwin, despite his beliefs about marriage, strongly disapproved of his daughter's relationship with Shelley. The lovers began to meet secretly, though, at the grave of Mary Wollstonecraft, make of that what you will, and in July 1814 they eloped, taking Claire Clairmont with them. But they had to return to England in September because they had no money. Godwin was furious. He refused to help them. Shelley's father had long been estranged from his son. They lived almost 2 years in England, dodging their creditors, living in rented lodgings, or staying with friends. Their finances improved when Percy's grandfather died and left them a legacy. Shortly after the elopement, in 1814, Mary had become pregnant. The child, a daughter, was born prematurely and did not survive. But in January 1816, at the age of 18, she gave birth to a son, William, named after her father and nicknamed Wilmouse. In May of 1818, Percy, Mary, Claire, and William left England for Switzerland. Claire had thrown herself at the infamous poet Lord Byron, who eventually obliged her, and they had a brief affair. Discovering that Byron was leaving for Geneva, Claire intended to follow him. They settled in a house on the shores of Lake Geneva, which was near the Villa Diodati, where Byron was staying with his physician and traveling companion, John Polidori. The five of them, Percy, Mary, Byron, Claire, and Polidori, spent a great deal of time together over that summer, especially because it was an unusually gray and wet summer in Switzerland. A volcanic eruption in Indonesia had caused record low temperatures and bad weather across the world. They read a great deal, some of it aloud, discussed poetry, politics, and the latest scientific discoveries. One night, when they had been reading a French collection of ghost stories together, Lord Byron issued a challenge. Each one of them should write a ghost story. Claire and Shelley didn't participate. Byron started a story, but eventually abandoned it, later publishing it as a fragment with his poem Mazeppa. John Polidori wrote a short horror novel, but later, inspired by Byron's fragment, he wrote The Vampire. Mary, though, thought long and hard about her story without coming up with any good ideas, until, as she told it in 1831, many years later, she had a dream, or a waking vision. I saw, with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork, horror-stricken. He would hope that left to itself the slight spark of life which he had communicated would fade, and this thing which had received such imperfect animation would would subside into dead matter, and he might sleep in the belief that the silence of the grave would quench forever the transient existence of the hideous corpse which he had looked upon as the cradle of life. He sleeps, but he is awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains and looking on him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes. I opened mine in terror. The idea so possessed my mind that a thrill of fear ran through me, and I wished to exchange the ghastly image of my fancy for the realities around. I see them still. The very room, the dark parquet, the closed shutters with the moonlight struggling through, and the sense I had that the glassy lake and white high Alps were beyond. I could not so easily get rid of my hideous phantom. Still it haunted me. I must try to think of something else. I recurred to my ghost story, my tiresome, unlucky ghost story. Oh, if I could contrive one which would frighten my reader as I myself had been frightened that night. Swift as light and cheering was the idea that broke in upon me. I have found it. What terrified me will terrify others, and I need only describe the spectre which had haunted my midnight pillow. On the morrow I announced that I had thought of a story. I began that day with the words, "It was on a dreary night of November," making only a transcript of the grim terrors of my waking dream. It would take Mary 9 months to turn this idea into the novel we will be reading over the next week, but this night saw the conception of Frankenstein.